Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
He gave me a book on art forgery. I found myself drawn to these old masters. How did these artists take paint from a palette, arrange it on a canvas? I began to unlock the secrets. I was a storehouse of knowledge of how to create an illusion, present it to an experienced expert, manipulate his mind, and convince him and bring him to the inevitable conclusion that the painting is genuine. We flooded the market with my paintings, and I couldn't believe what I did. I couldn't believe it. Then the dominoes started falling, and eventually the FBI were led to my door. They uncovered a mountain of evidence against me.
But they never actually got you. At this point, you've sold a lot. You've got like $1 million in cash. You sold one painting for $717,000. Why did it go away? Why did you never get indicted? And how are we having this conversation?
I guess it's the greatest story of all.
To hear how Ken Perenni made millions in art forgery, dodged the mafia and the FBI, subscribe to The Jordan Harbinger Show and check out episode 282 in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Do you love shows like Criminal Minds and Mindhunter? Are you interested in what it's really like for the agents that break down the psychology of violent offenders, serial killers, and sexual predators? If the answer is yes, you'll love The Consult, Real FBI Profilers. I'm Julia Cowley. I spent 22 years in the FBI and was assigned to the renowned Behavioral Analysis Unit. Join me, along with my colleagues, retired FBI profilers Angela Surser, Susan Kostler-Drew, and Bob Drew, as we look at some of the most notorious cases that have ever come into the Bureau. We'll take you inside the tape and into our thought processes as we analyze the behaviors, motives, and methods of criminals like JonBenet Ramsey's killer, serial killers like Israel Keys and Joe DeAngelo, and we'll examine some of the most perplexing cases, such as the murder of Washington, D.C. attorney Robert Wone. It's more than just a podcast. It's a real-world look at how the FBI uses criminal psychology to assist law enforcement in our mutual quest for justice. Join our brand new Patreon for early and ad-free episodes and listen to The Consult Real FBI Profilers, available wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our look at the Robert Wone case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my frantic co-host, Alice.
Hey, Brett, I am frantic. I am frantic to get to theories because this has been a long-awaited episode. We had to wait for you to go skiing. That's it. That's all. We've traveled a couple times since, we tried to get this on the books. But nay, on a Sunday night, we are here because I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear what people have to say. This is just a case, we've said this time and time again, that boggles all logical reasoning. There's obviously an answer. I hope we get close to it today.
I do too. We have been waiting on this one. We have been traveling some, so there was a lot of anticipation in the gallery. Every now and then, guys, we have life that interferes. Those of you listening on the podcast, you're like, what are you talking about? We just heard the last episode last week. Yeah, well, that's the advantage to waiting. If you get them ahead of time, sometimes you get a little impatient. But we're here. Alice is super excited. I don't know that I've ever seen her as excited as she is tonight to talk about Robert Wone. And this has been quite a journey. You guys have been talking about this case a lot. This is one I think that caught a lot of people's imagination just because so much happened in this case that's inexplicable. We're going to do our best to give you our view on that and maybe explain some of the unexplainable. But I think we're all going to be walking away from this with the mystery intact. I don't anticipate that we will answer all your questions, but maybe we can answer some of them. What we're talking about today are our theories. We have gone through, I'm not going to say all the evidence. Like every case we cover, there's always things that are left out there. We can't do it all. We've covered a lot of evidence. We're mainly going to be focusing on what we think about this case. But when we were talking about this beforehand, we thought there's one issue that we really haven't addressed. And Alice, I know you're passionate about this, so I'm just going to turn it over to you so you can talk for yourself about something that's bubbled up in the chats and on the gallery, and that is, what is Robert's involvement in his own murder?
Yeah, Brett, I think this is a really important topic to start off with because obviously it has a role in our theories, but it's so important. I think it deserves a discussion in and of itself, kind of separate from what actually happened that night that led to his death. And I want to reiterate something that you just said that I think is very important. We've given you the evidence as we know it in this case. There were at least 3 people in the house that night. We have their statements. We have different court documents based on what they've said and what they've not said as well. The evidence in this case is at the same time a lot as well as very limited because of limited testimony from kind of the only people who know what happened in that house. With that said, when you're a prosecutor, when you're a defense attorney, when you prosecute a case or when you're trying to decide how to approach a case, you don't stop there. Even when there are massive holes in your case, as there are in this case, you have to march forward and determine whether there is a story there that you're able to bring to court in some aspect, whether that be a civil case or a criminal case, or you back away. And that's what we've always done on these theories. And I want to reiterate it here because there are so many holes. We don't have any inside knowledge. We haven't talked to family members. We haven't talked to people who have information or evidence that is not otherwise public. What we do have is our ability to draw lines of reasoning when you have these massive holes. In some ways, that's what we specialize in, right? Like people don't bring us cases because they're like completely open and shut. We do get those cases, but that's not where our expertise is called to bear. It is when there are these massive holes in these puzzles that investigators bring them to us and say, help us. What are we supposed to do here? What happened here? So things you're hearing here tonight, our theories, are just that. There are theories. We are trying to make sense of something that is very difficult to make sense of. You don't have to agree with us. And we are not saying that this is exactly what happened that night. But at the end of all of these types of cases, Brett and I try to make sense because something did happen. There is an explanation. And our goal is always to try to get as close to that explanation as possible. And here's the thing, especially when you have these massive holes. There's just no way we are going to be able to tie up all of those loose ends. And as far as I can tell, there isn't one theory that basically answers all the questions. That's why this is one of the most enduring true crime mysteries that we've covered. And one of those mysteries is, why was Robert there that night? Did he know what was about to happen? Of course, not his death. But did he know that there was at least ill will towards him by somebody? And why do we think what we think? So, I don't think it is a secret at this point that we think the intruder theory is near impossible. Sure, there can be additional evidence that comes out later. Maybe we will, like in the Leo Schofield case, find some DNA later on, a glass pane or something along the way. Someone speaks up and we find out that there is some DNA that ties back to some home intruder, some serial killer right in the DuPont Circle area who was invading houses at this time. And we find out that there is some crazy tie to this case, like in Leo Schofield. I will not say never again because of the Leo Schofield case, where we saw kind of the impossible happen. 17 years later, we find DNA of someone who actually we think is involved. But currently, to this day, there's absolutely no evidence of an intruder. And I think it defies a lot of logic, Occam's razor, to begin to argue that this was the result of an intruder, which leaves us to the people in the house. We don't have to talk about who all is in the house yet. We'll get there for sure. But when you narrow it down from intruder theory, Xing that out and going to the people in the house had something to do with what happened to Robert, then any investigator is going to ask, who was in the house? What was their relationship with each other? What was their relationship with Robert? We know it's not a secret. It was very well known early in the investigation that the 3 men who lived in that house had relationships with each other. Whether it was a throuple, a 3-way relationship, or a triangle with one person being in relationships with 2 of them. Let's put that aside. What we know is 3 men who sought the attention of other men sexually lived in that house. And any investigator is going to ask, did Robert go there to seek some sort of sexual attention from another man? And this has been bubbling around this case as long as this case has been around, because it's very hard to avoid that question. And I think it's fine to ask that question. But I think once the evidence comes out, the question is answered and we need to leave that behind. There is zero evidence that Robert had any intention of going over there to seek any sort of sexual attention from any of the men in that house or from men ever. His electronics were exhaustively searched. His Blackberries, his computers, his search histories. There's no indication on online profiles or anywhere else that he's ever sought attention, sexual, friendship, otherwise, from men online. There's no indication that he sought this type of attention from anyone in his life. And let me just tell you something. Regularly in any type of case that we investigate, whether it is a very violent case or it's a white collar fraud case where nobody dies, no guns are involved. It's just a bunch of people stealing money from banks, electronically, not robbing banks. We get phone dumps. We get cell phones that belong to the perpetrators. And you know everything about these people. You can delete all you think you want from search histories, from phones, from emails, from web browsers. We will find them. And a lot of times we find a lot of what you do socially on those phones. I've joked about this before, but it's actually kind of true. I don't think I've ever seen a phone dump from a male perpetrator, no matter their crime, that doesn't have a picture of someone's genitalia that's male. Might be theirs, might be someone else's. I don't know why. Men, stop it. Stop saving pictures of male genitalia on your phones, yours or otherwise. And this is not an exaggeration. I've yet to come across a case, hundreds of case files that I've looked at, that I do not see male genitalia on a man's phone. Stop it. They're deleted, they're recovered. I don't know why. These crimes don't even have to do with male genitalia. My point being, people use their electronics incredibly personally. It's not just for work. It is for everything. You want to know where you want to go dinner? You pull up your phone or you pull up your computer that you're in front of all day as a lawyer and you search best Thai food in DuPont Circle. We basically know everything in terms of electronic footprint that Robert was doing. And there was no indication of any sort of men seeking men sexual attention. There's no indication that he was going there that night to seek anything other than a bed to sleep in, because it was a late night at his new job meeting the overnight crew for Radio Asia. So, again, I just want to know, it's fine to ask the question, but there's way too much rumor around how he was trying to cheat on his wife
with a man or a woman. There's also no indication he ever tried to cheat on his wife as a man or woman. And I think this is important because by perpetrating these types of rumors, it is re-victimizing Robert as well as his wife and his family and loved ones.
Yeah, a few things to add to that. Number one, what Alice said about cell phones is absolutely true. And
give me a case file that doesn't have that. Like, I am so sick of it. I literally, it's a joke with my agents that they'll be like, this one has 10. And I'm like, I know what those 10 mean.
And I'll just go and tell you, ladies, if you're sending pictures to your boyfriend or whatever, and he's involved in any sort of crime, eventually the federal agent's going to look at that because they usually have those photographs on there as well. So these are our PSAs for everybody out there. Just stop. But the other thing to remember is this was 2006. So at this point, number one, you didn't even have some of the technology that you have now that you can use to avoid some of that you can use to avoid tracking everywhere you're going on the internet, that you can use to hide certain things. And people didn't think about it as much. Back then, people just didn't think of their phones as having as much information as they did. And one reason was because they really didn't have as much information, but they certainly had things that were Robert engaged in some sort of affair with another man or seeking that kind of relationship, you would have seen. And this is not, well, he's a married man. That's what you hear a lot in the documentary. They keep going back to that. Well, he's a happily married man. Well, as we all know, being a happily married man is not an indication of whether or not you might be involved in a same-sex relationship. It happens all the time. But I think the fact that you see absolutely no evidence of it tells you that is not why he went over there. And I want to talk about one other thing. It's something that we haven't talked about up to this point, but it's important. And it's a piece of misinformation that's out there that I think, when you know the reality of it, can change your perception of what's going on here. And that's, when did he decide to go over there? It is often presented as this is a last minute thing. The kind of thing that maybe even the people who live there didn't know until the last minute that he was coming. That is not true. As a matter of fact, it was 2 weeks before August 2nd that he had started talking to his wife about potentially spending the night so that he could have this late night meeting with the overnight crew at Radio Asia. And at that point, he reached out to those two friends you always hear about. He reached out to two friends about staying there. And Joseph Price was the first person to respond to him. By July 31st, they had emailed about Robert's plans to come over there by taxi and that he was going to arrive around 11 p.m. So this is something that was set several days beforehand. So everyone in that house would have known that Robert was going to be there. So if one of your thoughts is, how could something like this have happened spontaneously in such a short period of time? It didn't have to happen spontaneously. If there's an aspect of this that was planned, it could have been planned days or even weeks before when Robert arrived. And that is something that is misreported in this case, and I think is actually pretty important and will play into our theories as we talk more about this case. Okay, Alice, do you want me to go first, or would you like to go first? I'm happy to go first, and you can
No. So,
wow everyone.
I think this will, no. I think this is going to be a back and forth sort of thing. I think that's a really great point about when he decided, and there was open conversation with his wife about staying overnight, and he had reached out. The other person he reached out to was a female friend, and like you said, it was Joe was the first one who had responded. But then once he knew he was staying with Joe, there was some back and forth communication and even planning about. Those of you who live in a city, are lawyers, you know that if you get an opportunity to see a friend, you'll then make plans around it. Like, oh, I'll be there then. Maybe we'll get together the next morning, before we have to run off to work. So this was not a surprise to at least Joe. He was communicating just with Joe at this time, but Joe lives with two other people, and there is no indication that anyone else was surprised by Robert's late arrival that night.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to talk about before we dive into theories is the evidence of sexual assault in this case. This is something that the defense would dispute at trial, that there was any evidence of sexual assault. Now, we've talked about this before. There was evidence of semen in Robert's anal cavity, and there was also evidence of semen on his body. Now, the defense would say, and would point to studies, that this is often misdiagnosed. They're often false positives for semen, particularly inside the body of a man after he dies. In fact, it can run as high as 60% of findings are a false positive. Medical examiners are aware of this, but they're also aware that that tends to happen after some period of time. You did not have a large period of time between when Robert was killed and when he was examined. In fact, he was found immediately after he was killed. He was taken to the hospital and examination was done. And if you read the studies on this phenomenon, it tends to be on bodies that are found a little bit later. The body secretes similar fluids that can mimic what you see in semen. The defense wanted to bring this evidence in. The problem with this, it never got fought out in court because the judge ruled that the evidence of sexual assault would be excluded from the trial. Basically said, look, whatever happened there is not evidence of a cover-up after the crime. I kind of find that to be silly. I think she made that decision when there was still talk of a jury. And she thought this is going to be more prejudicial than it is probative, the question of whether or not there was a cover-up after the case. And so she excluded it, and it was never revisited when the decision was made to make it a judge trial. The other thing about this is it's not just inside of Robert. You also found similar positives on his body. Now, there's a couple things about that. Number one, everyone seems to believe that Robert took a shower that night. Even if he didn't, the fact that you find it on his body would seem to indicate to you that this is something that happened relatively close to his death. You can go down a lot of rabbit trails with that, but I think you combine these two things. Number one, there's no evidence that he is involved in any sort of sexual activity with men, and yet you find some evidence of some sort of sexual activity on Robert. And I think that is going to play into this entire idea of what happened that day.
Absolutely. And I think that's important to note that while there may be other explanations of a positive indicator for semen, it doesn't seem like this is the situation for it. But at the same time, there wasn't cross-examination allowed for this type of information. But I think based on what we know, the timing of things, even if there's question of when 911 was actually called, how close in time to when Robert was killed or found, we're not talking about kind of the day or more of decomposition that would be needed to find this phenomenon to have occurred. And I think that's really, really important, the semen on the body. Now, what's interesting from the autopsy is while we do find semen, you're right when you say there doesn't seem to be indication of sexual assault in the sense of you're looking for lacerations, you're looking for other things other than semen that may indicate an assault, bruising, whatnot. So that is also not conclusive of no sexual assault, because sexual assault, I think a lot of people would say, is if something is being done to you in a sexual manner that is against your will without your consent, whether there are lacerations or bruisings or whatnot, right? So all we have are the records, but I am pretty confident to say that that was his semen on him rather than decomposition fluids based on the timeline we are looking at. Speaking of that timeline, this is an incredibly tight timeline. So let's walk through it together, Brett, because whatever happened incredibly quickly. Now, we know from immediate statements at the police station, I think it was Joe Price who told investigators, Robert came in, he had some drinks over the sink, and then we all went to bed. I think there's probably a lot of truth to that, because what do we find about Robert? He's in bed, dressed for bed, and he has his mouth guard in. Repeatedly, we have heard from his wife, people who've lived with him previously, that the last thing he does is put in his mouth guard. Personal experience, also the last thing I do, because it doesn't feel that comfortable. It's hard to, you can't eat with it. You don't brush your teeth with it, obviously. You do it after you brush your teeth. You can't really talk with it, or at least you talk kind of with a lisp whenever you have your mouth guard in. He was found dead with his mouth guard in. So, he had to have gone to bed pretty quickly. But that was the plan all along, remember? He wasn't coming to hang out. There wasn't a party that night. He wasn't staying overnight in the city because it was a celebration for something. He truly needed a pad to crash at because it was after 10 p.m. and his wife was going to be asleep and it was going to be more than an hour commute back home. He didn't want to wake her up. He had to be back in the city the next morning. It makes complete sense to me that pretty soon, really within 10, 20 minutes of getting to the house, he essentially goes to sleep, gets dressed, puts his valuables, his BlackBerry, and his 2 wallets, his real wallet and his decoy wallet in case he got mugged in DC, at the foot of the bed on the table, lays down, puts in mouth guard, and goes to sleep.
And can I just say one thing really quick about this? Because I think it's important as we go through this. There's so much we don't know, to lay out things that I think we probably do know. Some of this is still going to be speculative, but it's speculative based on the evidence we have. I think one thing we absolutely know is Alice is right. Robert got there to the house and quickly thereafter was in bed. People have asked about the 11:08 email that he sent, whether someone else could have sent it. I mean, could they have? I guess. But I think the simpler answer is, by that point, he's putting his mouth guard in. He's doing the last things he does before he goes to bed at night. He's putting his mouth guard in and he's sending an email. And I think we can say one of the things that we can feel pretty secure about is that the story of him getting there, spending very little time entertaining, and then quickly going to bed, being in bed, going to sleep is true.
And one other thing I think we can say about the retainer, I think he put it in. I don't think someone else put it in, because there are other things that are out of place if you were trying to cover up a scene that I don't think that level of detail for the mouth guard would have entered into someone's mind before, say, pretending to steal money from a wallet, 2 wallets that are there. And everyone is different. The absence of a retainer and a mouth is not conclusive at all of someone going to sleep. And it requires, especially if someone is unconscious or dead, to open their mouth and stick in the retainer. Retainers are specifically molded to your teeth, and those of you who have retainers know that it's actually a little bit hard to put in if you are not the one putting it in, because there is some level of kind of moving it into position. And so to have a third party do it for you is not only awkward, but also you kind of risk getting your DNA all over someone's mouth where, you know, things could be happening, especially if someone's unconscious, that the scene is messy enough in terms of red herrings for other things that should be out of place if an intruder were there, that I don't think anyone but Robert was the one to put in the mouth guard. Okay, with that said, if it's 11:08 and he's sending an email, we have no indication that the email was sent by anybody else. And again, there are kind of other things to move the timeline if you wanted to alter the timeline. I'm not sure that's the best one to do. Let's say 11:08, puts in mouth guard, sends last email, goes to sleep. We are still talking about a really, really tight timeline in which Robert needs to fall asleep and someone needs to stab him where he's so dead asleep that he doesn't react to 3 separate stabs. I don't think it's possible for him to not have been under some influence to not move. I don't care if he'd been asleep for 4 hours and he was in the deepest of REM cycles. After that first stab, it would jolt you awake and you would react. Even if you're not conscious awake, your hands would grab at your chest and there would be indication of blood on other parts of his body as he tried to go into life-saving measures, kind of like, you know, hammer on your knee sort of thing. It's reflexive. You can't even keep yourself from doing that. Nor do we see any sort of ligature marks tying him down. So I do not think he was restrained physically, yet he was in a state where within minutes, he was not able to react to something very serious to his body that would be reactionary and not something he could control with his mind or body.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy, comfy. I'm cozy, cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. Blisters. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. 1 purchased equals 1 donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Okay, so what do we have now? I think what we have is he voluntarily went up to his room, he put his mouth guard in, he sent his email, he laid down to go to sleep. Second thing I think we have, Alice is right. The fact that the stab wounds, there's no movement, the fact that there's no sign of restraints, even if you think the stab wounds are secondary to his death, which we'll get into in a second, it seems clear that he was drugged. He was drugged in some way. And something was done to him so that when he was stabbed, he would not react. So I think that is a second fact that we can say for certain. And we're doing this is almost like a Sherlock Holmes thing. You know, we're
it's almost like
eliminating the
crossing out
impossible.
what couldn't have happened.
Exactly. We're eliminating the impossible. Whatever remains, no matter how improbable, has to be the answer. So I think he was drugged. Now, there's a couple ways that could have happened. If you guys have watched the documentary, there's a lot of talk about this drug, succinylcholine. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but it's a drug that is metabolized very quickly in the body to the extent that even if you tested for it in Robert's blood, you wouldn't find it. It's a drug that is widely available in hospitals. You have to remember, there's a couple ways this could have been obtained. Number one, as we've talked about, Price's brother worked in a hospital. He is someone who is often pointed out as a possible suspect. It may be that he had no involvement in the murder whatsoever, but he may have provided this drug for any number of reasons. I have talked to people and asked whether or not this is anything that's ever used recreationally. People say no, but you never know what people are going to do. You have the injection sites, which aren't accounted for in the autopsy. Now, several of them are, and I think it's possible there was no injection. But remember, Robert did have a drink, and this could have been something that was slipped into his drink. He drank it, and that's what led to him essentially being paralyzed when whatever happened to him happened to him. Remember, the people who lived at that house had advanced notice he was coming. If they had decided to do something to him, even if it wasn't a murder, they could have prepared for this by having a paralytic available.
And talking about this drug, which I'm not going to try and pronounce because I'm not going to get it right, the succinylcholine. S-choline. What we do know about it is apparently when you are training to be, what was he training to be? What's the
phlebotomist.
Word? Phlebotomist. This is a very common drug that's going to be on any cart around. Yes, there are obviously strictures around these. They're supposed to be recorded, not recorded. I will say that I've certainly been in an ICU room where there were vials of fentanyl right before my son was supposed to be intubated that they ended up thank God, not having to intubate him. And they lost 3 vials of fentanyl. Like, I'm just saying. And it was a very emergent situation. All the lights were going off. Things were flashing. And I literally saw them pull out the 3 vials of fentanyl, which were going to be too much for his small body. But obviously, you don't want to be searching for additional drugs when you're in the midst of it. And the doctor was about to inject him with it in order to intubate him. And literally, there was like a call from on high, like the director of the entire area said, wait 10 minutes, see if he comes out of this. And all the doctors in the room, there were like 10 doctors in the room, were like, he's not going to come out of it. And 10 minutes passed, and this director was correct. He did not need to be intubated. But in that time, there were no fewer than 30 nurses, doctors, nurse anesthetists, phlebotomists coming into our room, and they lost the 3 vials of fentanyl because they had to search all of our bags, and we didn't have much on us, but they had to search us because they couldn't account for those 3 vials. All I'm saying is, it happens, especially when you have night classes all the time. And this particular drug is something that phlebotomists use a lot because it is so fast acting in emergent situations when you need to do something like a trach. You have to put in a trach, something that is very painful, especially if you're fully aware and awake. Say you just got into a car accident, you get wheeled into the ER, they need to stick something down your throat. That's going to be very painful. They need it to act immediately because if not, you could die in the next minute. That's why they use a drug like this that is so incredibly fast acting.
And as the prosecution pointed out, succinylcholine is used in exactly that sort of circumstance, and it's used in emergencies. It's on every crash cart in every hospital. If you worked in a hospital, even if you're not the kind of person who used it, if you wanted to get your hands on it, you could. And you could get a vial of it, and nobody would ever notice. This is not the kind of thing that you're going to have, some sort of strict recording. Somebody's going to notice, oh no, there's a vial of succinylcholine missing. Whatever shall we do? If you've worked in a hospital, that's not how that's going to go.
And that's a really good point, right? Fentanyl, we know of abuses. I will say I did a lot of drug cases that had to do with doctors, like misappropriated drugs from the doctors or the nurses. I had lots of investigations involving doctors or nurses stealing drugs that they could then either abuse themselves or sell on the secondary market, black market. And obviously fentanyl was a huge one that they would steal. I have never heard of succinylcholine. That has never shown up. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But when asking a lot of friends who work in the medical field, I was like, is this something that people abuse, that you're afraid of a nurse going to take it and giving themselves an IV, which happens, by the way. They do that with fentanyl a lot, morphine a lot, unfortunately. Is that one of the drugs you would expect them to use? And they're like, most of my medical friends say no, because it works so quickly that essentially is like a paralytic. It puts you asleep immediately. So you can't exactly go into the break room. You can shoot up fentanyl and be high as a kite and go about your day, but you can't be on the floor, passed out, asleep. They will immediately find you, know what happened, and you lose your job, right? And so the medical people that I spoke with were like, that's not a drug that we see abused by the medical professionals because they would be caught immediately. You need a drug that you can continue to work in.
So I think it is undoubtedly the case he was drugged. He was drugged with something. He was drugged with something that wasn't found in the toxicology screens. Succinylcholine is a popular choice. Could have been something else, but that's a popular choice, and I think it's something that you could get your hands on if you knew someone who worked in medicine fairly easily.
And that's the whole point right here. I am not saying that the brother is a suspect here. I think there is absolutely no evidence, in fact, that he's a suspect at all. I think his phone has him at home that night. Sure, phones can be turned off, whatever. Based on what I was saying previously about Robert not having any indication of having sought, male attention or going over here for sex that night, I think the same applies to the brother. I don't think, for everything I know, there is no indication that he was in that house that night or had anything to do with Robert ending up dead. But what I think is very important when you are trying to introduce some way of understanding how Robert was drugged in a way that does not show up on a drug test, you have to show opportunity. And here is an opportunity for the men in the house to get access to an otherwise not over-the-counter drug that could act in a way to achieve the goals that we're about to talk about and evade detection on a drug test. So let me be clear. I have nothing against brother right now. And I don't know why brother would take this. Maybe someone asked him to take it. I don't know. But what I'm showing is that there is absolutely opportunity for the three men in this house to have acquired this drug that we are now introducing.
And there's another problem if you're giving someone a sedative, and that's that you can give them too much. And in fact, if you give them too much, you can kill them. And there's a couple different ways you can kill them. One is their heart stops and they stop breathing. The other is it seems like their heart has stopped and they've stopped breathing. It's hard to say exactly what happened in this case, but there's one thing that's interesting, a fact that nobody can ever really figure out, and that's that Robert had petechial hemorrhages in his eyes, but not many, only one or two. Now, what causes petechial hemorrhaging? One thing can be being strangled to death. That is a common symptom you'll see of that kind of murder. There's no evidence that Robert was strangled. There's no damage to his throat. There are no bruising around his throat. He didn't fight back. You got to remember, one of the things that's important here is however he was killed without fighting back at all. There's no evidence that he fought back. And there's not a lot of petechial hemorrhages. In fact, there's only one in each eye. Something else that can cause petechial hemorrhaging is when you are given a sedative. Two things can happen. Number one, if you're given too much and your breathing becomes too low, you can have petechial hemorrhaging. The other thing is you can see petechial hemorrhaging when you are sedated and your eyes are not taped shut. So your eyes are just open because nobody bothered to tape your eyes shut. You can have damage to your eyes. This is something that happens a lot in surgeries. So if Robert was drugged, if he was sedated, that could be the cause of his petechial hemorrhaging. The other thing, if you give him too much, as I said, he could either die or he could appear to be dead. What do you have in this case? You not only have the fact that you have identical wounds that show no movement whatsoever, no tearing, no resistance whatsoever, you don't have a lot of external bleeding. You have a lot of internal bleeding. Let's assume for a second that the defense is right, that this is not a case where he was killed in some other place and cleaned up. The prosecution was never able to really show any evidence that there was a large amount of blood in some other part of the house. Now, some of that was because of some problems they had with the testing. They didn't use the testing right, and so basically they lost the opportunity to prove that there was a lot of blood elsewhere. But given the amount of time that passed, it doesn't seem like there was some murder somewhere else. A lot of blood was spilled. It was all cleaned up, and then his body was placed in the bed. It seems more like he was killed in the bed. He was stabbed 3 times while he was in the bed, and yet there's very little external bleeding. That could have been because of one of two things. Actually, I think it could only be one thing. If he were just dead, let's say he were dead and these were all post-mortem stab wounds, I don't think you would see as much internal blood loss as you see. But if his heart was barely beating, maybe so much that you thought he was dead and you stabbed him, then you might not see the sort of gushing blood that you tend to expect when someone's heart is beating and their blood pressure is high and you have blood spatter all over the place, which you don't see in this case. So I think what you have here is when he is stabbed, his heart is barely beating at all. And that takes us to how people test for blood loss, which I think is very important in this case. And Alice, I know you have thoughts about this.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree with you there. There is no indication that he was stabbed elsewhere. Blood was cleaned up and then he was moved into the bed. It's not just that they didn't find blood, which I think is a huge thing, because I know there's going to be people who say, oh, they messed up the testing for the blood. You would have to mess up a lot not to be able to find this amount of blood somewhere. It wasn't on any of the people in the house. It wasn't on the, additional towels, things that would soak up this blood. We're talking a lot of blood if you were stabbed, just if your heart is beating as yours and mine are right now. So instead, I do think he was stabbed in his bed where he was ultimately found. So when your heart slows so much to almost, and people have said that if you don't know what you're doing and you administer this drug and you administer too much, the person can appear that they are dead. So much so that they're breathing so little that you can't even perceive their chest moving up and down. And that includes your heart, how slow it's beating. And when your heart stops beating very fast or fast enough to circulate the blood all throughout your body, we've seen this before if you have very low blood pressure, blood starts to pool. Even when you're not completely dead, even when your heart isn't completely stopped, it begins to pool because gravity happens. And the only reason your blood isn't pooling right now is because your body continues to pump that blood all throughout your body. But as you know, if you are very overweight or you've been pregnant before, you know that when you stand all day, what happens to the lower extremities of your body after you've been standing all day? You get swelling in your feet because of gravity. So even when your heart is pumping at normal levels, gravity does its work and pulls down blood. Now imagine you don't have that pump circulating that blood throughout your body and you are laying horizontal. Blood begins to pool to the lowest area because that's what gravity does. It pulls it down away from your chest. So let's say that Robert was laying on his back at some point, or at least he was laying with his chest exposed at some point to be able to suffer these stab wounds. Let's just say, since he was found in this position, that he was laying on his back. Where would that blood pool to? The lowest points from where it is. That would be your buttocks, your back, away from your chest, where we see the stab wounds. Basically, away from the areas where there are puncture wounds where blood can push out. And we know this from past cases that if your blood's not pumping, if you have a puncture wound, it's the pumping that actually spurts blood out. But if your heart is barely pumping at all, not only is the blood pooling away from, in this case, where the stab wounds are occurring, but you also don't have the outward spurt movement of blood being pushed out of the wound. Doesn't mean there's no blood at all. But I think at the time that he received these stab wounds, a good amount of his blood, and it doesn't take very long. Think about, I don't know, if you guys make like a science experiment with a water and oil and you like shake it up to try and mix it, or you have glitter in there, like different glitter bombs, you shake it. Doesn't take very long if you put it down for everything to settle, right? Under a minute. Same with blood. The viscosity is going to start pooling down. And I think when he received those stab wounds, I'm not convinced he was completely dead, because we do see some blood, but so little blood that there was certainly not spurting. So his heart wasn't beating at a rate that would allow blood spatter. But then you have the question of, well, where did all that blood go? Because didn't the autopsy say about a third of his blood volume was missing? But we didn't find it. So if we can't find it, it must mean it's down a drain or it was cleaned up in some way, right? I'm not convinced of this. So when you do an autopsy, you don't calculate blood loss by draining an entire corpse of all its blood and measuring it. That's not what happened in this case. Rather, you take, like many things in medicine, a percentage from the areas that you expect to have blood, and you calculate based on these samples how much blood was lost. I think that works if your theory is that he was alive and well and his heart was beating when he was stabbed in the chest, and you would expect to find blood in certain areas. But I'm not positive. We don't have more details about the autopsy and the samples and where they were drawn. But I think when you have a different situation where you're not stabbed, when your heart is alive and beating well, you have a different situation where blood was pooled in the first place before you were even stabbed. Blood may be collecting in areas of the body, such as maybe your organs, that would not be the typical places you would go sample blood to calculate the blood loss. So I think there is a very high possibility that he's not actually missing a third of his volume. I don't know that for a fact. But I think when you are going by, we know that they think he died from stab wounds. And so you conduct your autopsy in that manner. The starting point is he died by stab wounds. But I think if you flip it, that the stab wounds were secondary to his heart essentially stopping in the first place before he was stabbed. You're looking at a different distribution of blood.
Right. And there are a couple things we know happened in this case. Number one, we know that some of his blood was digested. Even the ME acknowledges that, which indicates that he was still alive when blood started going into his digestive system. The other thing, there's an argument that his body never should have been moved. There's an argument that he was dead in that bed. I know that the EMTs will disagree with that, but it seems like there never really was any indication of life from the moment they found him. But they took him to the hospital. When they took him to the hospital, there were various things that were done. I think it's possible some of the blood ended up there. It was disposed of one way or the other through those life-saving measures. But I think you're right. I think the problem in this case, and the reason you have this weird thing, is when the prosecution and the investigators first heard there's so much blood missing, it was kind of like Leo Schofield. That was a big thing for us. How can there be this much blood missing and there's none in the trailer? He must have been stabbed somewhere else. Oh, there's a bunch of blood in the dirt next to where she was dumped. That's where she was stabbed, right? The prosecution was looking for that blood, and they couldn't stop thinking about where is the blood. And so their theories got sort of wilder and wilder. Maybe he was murdered somewhere else and then brought there. Well, the problem with that is we know from the cab driver that he absolutely made it to that house. And then you'd have to believe that they were smart enough. They knew his password, got into his phone, sent an email to his wife, and then put a mouth guard in. And maybe they were, but as Alice said, they then forgot to take any money out of his wallet. The most basic thing they forgot, but they remembered to do those things. Or, he was murdered and then washed off. Well, the problem is, remember how fast this had to happen. And remember what state his body was in when the EMTs found him. He was already cold. he seemed like he had been dead for some time. And there's just not a lot of time involved in this case. So it seems to me the only answer is when you combine the fact that there is no evidence of defensive wounds whatsoever. There's no evidence of any method of killing him. There's no, he wasn't hit over the head. He wasn't strangled. None of those things happened. All we have are perfectly symmetrical stab wounds, which seem to indicate that when he was stabbed, he did not move at all. Well, if you combine, he was drugged in some way, and you can argue about which drug it was and whether it was injected or whether he drank it. But if he was drugged in some way to the point that his heart had slowed and then stabbed, everything starts to make sense. The blood then makes sense. And up to this point, we are talking about what happened, not why it happened. So forget why it happened for now. People always want to think about motive. We're not talking about motive. We're talking about what had to happen for his body to have been in the state it was in. We will get to motive and exactly what happened in a second. But right now, we're just talking about what you are seeing. And I think what you're seeing is someone who, by the time they were stabbed, they weren't dead, but they were close to it. And that could inform why they were stabbed in the first place. Any other facts you want to talk about, or are you ready to dive into the theories? I'll go ahead and I have a very basic theory, so I'll go do my theory, and yours is very detailed, so I can do my theory, and you can.
Okay, yeah, go for it. Okay, so this is not the way we planned to do this, but I think this is very important because how his body ended up the way it ended up, I think we can pull on a lot. Of course, there's a lot of question marks, but we can pull on a lot of what's in the evidence. This next part, honestly, y'all's guess is as good as ours, but we are reading from all of the testimony and trying to understand how someone who didn't go there to seek anything other than a place to lay his head that night ended up dead within the hour.
And I have sort of very broad strokes of a theory. I'm interested to hear Alice's because I know Alice has been thinking about this a lot. But as we've done up to this point, I think there are certain facts which I just believe are you can't argue with. I mean, you will, because that's what you guys do. But I think you can't argue with a couple things. Number one, I think he absolutely arrived at that house. I think he had a drink with them. I think all that happened. I think he went up, got in bed, put his mouth guard in, which his wife says the last thing he did before he went to sleep, and sent an email. I think at some point he was drugged. It was possible he was injected with something. Maybe he drank something. If he was injected with something, it would have been after he got in bed, and it would have acted so quickly that even if he woke up and was like, "What are you doing?" he then very quickly would have passed out. Just think about any time you've had surgery and the doctor asks you to count back from 10 and you get to like 8 and then you're out of it. So I think he would have been out pretty fast. I think that drug, too much was given to him. I think it was given to him by someone who wasn't a doctor, wasn't medically trained at all. I think it was given to him by one of the 3 people in that house, and I think they gave him too much, and I think they thought he was dead. I don't know if you guys have ever read or seen the movie Murder on the Orient Express, but Murder on the Orient Express is very similar to what I think happened in this case. I think someone in that house had a reason that they were going to drug Robert. Exactly what that reason is hard to say. When you talk about motive in this case, I think it's very difficult. But there are a few things that we know. We know, for instance, that Dylan Ward and Joe Price were in sort of a volatile relationship, a relationship that often verged on, and maybe not verged, but went full into BDSM, where there was someone who was in charge, all that stuff. I think Alice is going to talk more about that. But one thing that we read about in the opinion of the court was that by this time, things were sort of falling apart. And there was an attempt by Joe, a willingness by Joe to do whatever it took to get Dylan back in this relationship. I think somebody decided to drug Robert for some sort of sexual reason. I think the thought was that he would be drugged and he would forget everything that happened and he would never know. I think too much was given to him. And I think at that point, whoever drugged him kind of freaked out. There are 2 people who I think were definitely involved in this. I'm not sure who did the drugging, but one of them, either Dylan Ward or Joe Price, I think is the person who drugged Robert. I think when that person realized that Robert wasn't breathing or believed he wasn't breathing, the other person was brought into it. And I think a decision was made at that time that Robert was dead. There was nothing that could be done for him. And the only thing that could be done was to save them by making it look like it was an intruder. I think one of them went downstairs, retrieved a knife from the knife block, and went back up. I think the person who killed Robert, as we talked about last time, was standing on the far side of the bed from the doorway. The person who got the knife came in through the doorway, reached across the bed, handed the knife to that person, and they then stabbed Robert 3 times in exactly the same orientation, in exactly the same depth, to make it look like it was a murder when in fact, well, it was a murder, but to make it look like it was an intruder murder and a stabbing murder when in fact they thought he was already dead. He wasn't dead, and that's why you see the blood as you see it. I think at this point, Zaborski, who has not been involved until this point, comes downstairs, sees what's going on, and screams. That is the scream that the neighbors heard sometime in the 11 to 11:30 hour while they were watching the nightly news. At that point, the other two had to start working on him to get him calmed down. A lot of time passed where they're getting him calmed down and getting their story straight before they make that final phone call. And that's why when the police arrive and the EMTs arrive, Robert's body is already going cold because, in fact, he has been dead, more or less, for much longer than would be indicated by the 911 call. They make the 911 call, and from that point forward, they stuck to their story because they were all in it together. One aspect that I think is sexy and you kind of want to believe it is 3 people, 3 stab wounds. Those of you who've seen or read Murder in the Orient Express, you know what I'm talking about. The problem with that is the fact that each stab wound was the exact same orientation and the exact same depth. I think one person did the stabbing at the behest of another, and I do think that Zaborski, his involvement in this was just covering it up. Now, I think it's absurd that the court reached the opinion it did. I don't think it is possible for this murder to have occurred and for one of them to have been involved and all 3 not have been involved in the cover-up. I think they should have been found guilty of obstruction of justice. I think it's unfortunate that they weren't, but I think the judge just did not have the courage that we often talk about, that juries often have, to make the hard call and find someone guilty when they believe they are guilty. And in this case, I think the judge believed they were guilty, but didn't have the guts to say they were guilty, and that's why they walked free. So that's sort of my theory. I do not have as many details as everybody would like, because the fact of the matter is, I don't think you'll ever know exactly what happened in that house unless one of them talks, and I don't think any of them ever will talk.
Yeah. I mean, there's very little that I disagree with there, Brett, but it still is a theory that is so wanting. Not because you have left anything out. It's just there is no way to understand what actually happened without one of the 3 men talking. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to try to understand. First, I started this episode off with saying that I really wanted to address the fact that Robert had nothing to do with his death, right? There's a second thing that I think is very important here. I do not think the men in that house intended to kill Robert that night at all. It was a cover-up because they thought they had accidentally killed him. And this is all incredibly sad because I don't know how much he was given of that drug or what drug he was given. But when you overdose someone, there is usually a way, there's a possibility if you seek medical help immediately that they can be saved. I don't know if Robert was so past that point that he couldn't have been saved, but I do not think he was dead when they thought he was dead and they administered those stab wounds as a cover-up. And that makes me very sad because I think there's a world in which they messed up and they could have called for medical help. Remember, the paramedics came incredibly quickly. In under, 6 minutes? When they finally called? There is a world in which they could have been completely honest about what happened, about the drug they administered, the amount they administered, how they administered it, where it was administered, and why they thought he was overdosed, and his life could have been saved. But instead, they took the cowardly way out, which is to make this seem like an intruder came in and stabbed him. So that's a second point that I think is important to note. I do not think this is a premeditated murder. I do think it is a panicked cover-up. So let's go back. We've talked to some people who are close to Robert, and while the police found out pretty quickly that there was a relationship between Joe and Victor, I think everyone knew that. They were married. A lot of people have said that term. I don't know if they had gone through the actual work of going out, being married, but they held themselves as being married. People have described them repeatedly as being married. But it wasn't actually known to everyone that Dylan and Joe were in a relationship. People certainly knew. And I think the person who lived and rented the apartment under their house, the basement apartment, also knew that Dylan and Joe were in a relationship. And police said that pretty much as soon as they started investigating this case, people close to the couple or the throuple indicated that the three men had some sort of sexual relationship among the three of them, whatever that exact setup was. But I think it's also important to note that there were people who were friendly with them. Maybe not in their exact circles. Maybe we're not in their, LGBTQ community specifically, but in their professional circles who did not know that Dylan was in a relationship with Joe, that Dylan was just another roommate. I don't think we know whether Robert knew Dylan and Joe were in a relationship. It's possible. But remember, Joe and Robert go way back to their college days. And in a lot of ways, Robert was looking up to Joe kind of like a mentor. He was a few years ahead of him at school, and they were both attorneys in DC, and they had, a close personal relationship, but they were personal friends really because of circumstance, right? Because they had gone to college together and because they were practicing in the same city together. So I don't know if he knew about Dylan. But what we do know from the investigation is that Dylan and Joe were on the outs, and it was in kind of one direction. Joe really wanted Dylan to come back into the relationship, but Dylan, I think, had lost some interest. We also know that they both had BDSM materials, whether online or physically, that kind of the materials that you use for BDSM materials. And people who knew them and their relationship specifically said that Joe was the submissive one in the BDSM relationship and that Dylan was the domineering one, the dom versus the sub, which, as we've noted before, seems to be the opposite of what really happened in real life, right? When the police came talking to the three of them, Joe seemed to be the one in charge of all three of them, right? He was the one who talked. He was the one who gave a withering glare to Dylan as he started to speak to the police. So seemingly, at least on the external social world, Joe did not appear to be the sub. But we also know from the investigation that these dom-sub relationships in the BDSM realm are taken very seriously. That a dom can force their sub to do a number of things. And it's actually that specific domineering relationship that gives rise to a lot of the excitement in the relationship. So the sub is not being abused, so to speak, but they actually want to be the sub and they are part of the relationship specifically to be dominated. So we have a bit of time before Robert shows up that night that we know Victor's on a business trip. He says that. Victor says that he never even saw Robert that night. He was getting home late that night. We have Dylan and Joe, who are going to be in the house that night when Robert arrives. And I think that very likely Joe, probably like a good roommate, maybe a good boyfriend, would tell the other people in the house if they're going to have a guest come by. You don't want to walk into your study and be scared out of your pants, right? Because someone's sleeping there. So very likely, ahead of time, pretty soon after Joe had set the plans with Robert, he probably told Dylan and Victor. Victor may not have thought about it because he was going to be out of town until later that night. Dylan probably knew that it was likely going to be him, Joe, and Robert at home that night. And Victor may have come home late. Victor said that he came home and everyone had gone to bed and he went to bed. That he didn't see Robert that night. He didn't have drinks with him, right? So that may have calculated into Dylan and Joe's thinking that night. Now let's talk about just who had the most opportunity in the house. It's not a secret. Who is closest in distance from the room that Robert was found stabbed in? Dylan. He's on the same floor. He's a door away, 2 doors away, I guess, if both doors are closed, where he's there. We've talked to a lot of people who knew Robert and Joe back in their friendship days, and repeatedly we heard they were close friends. Joe really did care about Robert as a friend. That was not a fake friendship. Their friendship lasted, well over a decade. This was a real friendship. And the reason a lot of people bought the intruder theory when it was first told by the 3 men, people who knew Robert and Joe said they of course believed it because There is no reason that Joe would ever lie about this. They were close friends. And we have no other indication that they weren't actually close friends.
In fact, they had plans to have breakfast the next morning to discuss a business opportunity. So they were about to get even closer, not only be friends, but have some business together. So there's no indication of any falling out at all between them.
And because of this, that makes me think that Joe is not the primary mover in what's about to happen. Like Brett said, all three have a role in obstruction of justice. But because of this having plans the next morning for business and this close friendship that everyone who knew them, even after the fact, even when they knew that Joe was accused of Robert's murder, no one came forward and said, you know what, now in hindsight, he was creepy around him, or he did indicate he wanted to hurt him, but only in these BDSM circles. We see none of that after the fact. Because of that, I don't think the first person to move that set the motion of what was going to happen that night was Joe. And that leaves one person, because Victor was gone. Joe, we talked about this long-standing relationship. Dylan is the dom in the relationship. And he also has the upper hand in the relationship, because from our understanding of interviews with people who knew them during the investigation is that Dylan didn't really care about coming back to the relationship with Joe, but Joe repeatedly wanted to show his loyalty to Dylan, to draw him back into the relationship. We heard that multiple times, I think, in the police reports. Joe wanted to draw Dylan back into the relationship. Well, Dylan has access to now one of the most precious things to Joe, one of his oldest friends, who we have had other people explain to us that Joe felt like a big brother to Robert, felt protective of him because Robert was kind of this sweet, kind person that never had an enemy. That's how he's been described by multiple people who knew him through the years. That he was just a kind person who did things that, made sure to ask about your loved ones, made sure to ask about important things in your life. He was a thoughtful person. And Dylan recognizes that he has access basically to something that's very precious to Joe. And I don't know what happened, but I think there was some sexual assault here. But he couldn't do that to someone who was unwilling. My very first thought was, they had drinks and he slipped him something. The thing is, everything happened so quickly, something would have popped up in the toxicology report. So I do think that it had to have been an injection of some sort. The succinylcholine, I don't know my medicines well enough, but it seems like it hits all the right things, right? It happens within seconds. It takes effect within seconds. And if you black out within seconds, it's very possible that all he thinks Robert will see is a dark figure. Could have been a dream. Nothing else happened. And that's what he was banking on. But why paralyze him? Well, you paralyze someone when you perhaps want to either do something to them that they would fight against. And it doesn't have to be anything that leaves a mark. In fact, really, except for the stab wounds, there are no marks left. There's no ligature marks. You don't need to tie someone down who's unrestrained. But you can imagine that someone who is laying prone, completely at someone else's disposal, may direct someone else to do certain things to them. Maybe with some of the BDSM tools that were in Dylan's closet. I don't know what happened next, but I think the purpose was not for Dylan to have fun. I think this had to do with a relationship imbalance. This had to do with some sort of psychological warfare that went far beyond anything we can imagine. Because I don't think Dylan had any interest in sexually assaulting Robert. That wasn't the point. That's not why you go to a paralytic. Why do that when you have two other men who are right upstairs? That's way too risky. If what you're seeking is just sex with someone, go anywhere else. You can seek it online. You have online profiles. You don't have to face all the risks of doing this in the house with other people who can find you with someone who might remember. So I don't think Dylan wanted to do anything. Rather, I think he either wanted to set something up to force Joe to do something, or maybe do something himself in a way that wasn't for his own sexual pleasure, but to show dominance to Joe through his best friend who is not gay, who is someone who would never be found in this type of a situation. I don't know how that works. I haven't been in these types of relationships. I don't hang out on these boards, but there's some massive amount of psychological control here. Except he's not a doctor. And I'm not sure he necessarily uses this drug all the time. Maybe they do use it on each other. I don't know. But Robert's not a huge guy, and it doesn't take very much to overdose someone. And certainly if you don't know how to do it, and it's not someone you've ever done it on before. And I think in the process of this, they thought he was dead. And there was no way they could be convicted of Robert's murder for lots of reasons. This is Joe's friend. I think at some point Joe enters the picture. I don't think Joe knew what was happening at first, but pretty soon after, I think Joe was brought into the picture. And we've talked about the angle of the stab wounds, how you had to be standing or whatnot. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think all the awkwardness of the angles holds true if you're talking about an intruder who has a goal to quickly stab and kill someone and leave. I think that angle is very bizarre because you can't quite go back fast enough. You have to do those 3 stab wounds pretty quickly before the person reacts, before the people upstairs or across the hall hear you and you run out. But I don't think the angles are necessarily weird or difficult to do if you are doing them slowly and deliberately. Because I think whoever stabbed him, and I think it was either Dylan or Joe, had to think about it as they did it. And it was not necessarily something they wanted to do, but I think they had to do it because they had to make it look like an intruder. And so think about anything that you do in your life. If you're cutting a piece of meat, if you have all the time in the world to do it, you can achieve any angle that you want. And I think the angle is so tortured because the person who was stabbing him didn't really want to stab him. They had to stab him. And I also think that the knife was probably not the kitchen knife. Because why go all the way downstairs? The plan wasn't to kill him. The plan was not to stab him. The closest knife was actually down the hall. And because of that, because that knife that is missing from the cutlery set that has never been recovered came from Dylan's closet, I think the idea to stab was Dylan's. Because I think he was the one who went and got the knife and said, this is what we have to do. That is all unknown until the 3 people in that house say something. I think Victor walked in after the stabbings because I don't think that amount of screaming would have happened had it just been he found the 3 of them in some sort of like menage a trois. Because it would have been like, what the heck? This is weird. I mean, you guys do stuff like this all the time, so maybe. No, that scream was one of utter despair because he saw someone dead in his house. So I think he walked in either at the time of the stabbing or right after the stabbing. And the saddest part about all this is they've banded together and they refuse to talk. And the thing about more than one person being in on something, conspiracies, is that eventually someone talks. But until someone talks, I don't think that we will actually know what happened. But I think it's important to try and figure out the motive of what happened that night because it's shrouded in so much mystery that a lot of the mystery ends up hurting Robert and his loved ones when the focus, I think, is completely misdirected. The focus should be on the 3 men in the house. The 3 of them know what happened. Maybe they know to varying degrees what happened, but collectively they know what happened and they have kept the truth from coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think our theories are basically the same. I think it was Dylan Ward who stabbed him. The one place I would disagree. Well, I'll start with, if you tackle this case and you think through it and you've been thinking through it with us for the last 4 episodes, now 5 episodes, the things that you have to deal with are the basic impossibility of an intruder. I mean, the fact, I'm convinced by the prosecution's argument that you couldn't get over that fence without leaving some sort of evidence of it. And the fact that the best the defense could do is come up with the sandbox on the other side having a depression in it. And that was where they went over when, if they went over there, they would have fallen to their death down the stairwell. Tells me that there is no intruder here. It was too fast. There's no motive. There's no evidence of an intruder. Nothing was stolen. Using the knife, no way in. There's just all sorts of reasons to think there's not an intruder. So if there's not an intruder, then the only option is it's one of these 3 guys. Or maybe Michael, if you want to throw Michael in. But I think Michael has a pretty good alibi. And I think the fact that his phone was not there tells you a lot. Because in 2006, I don't think he would have thought to leave his phone behind, particularly if he wasn't going in there to kill anyone. So I think it was one of those 3 guys. If it was one of those 3 guys, it had to happen in a very quick period of time. 70-something minutes from the moment Robert walked in. 40-something minutes from the moment that last email was sent. There's just not a lot of time for him to have gotten in an altercation with someone An altercation, by the way, that resulted in no defensive wounds whatsoever and symmetrical, identical stab wounds, all in the exact same orientation. Bleed somewhere else, clean that up, then put the body in the bed. It doesn't make sense. He wasn't strangled. He wasn't smothered. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't shot. If he was poisoned, it had to be something like succinylcholine because it didn't show up in the tox report. So you have a situation where the only thing that really makes sense here is for some reason he was drugged and then stabbed. Figure that out however you want to, but that's the only thing that makes sense. And I think the theory that Alice has laid out and the theory that I laid out earlier is the one that makes the most sense given the situation in that house. Now, the thing I will disagree with, I do think this would make sense from Dylan's perspective because of how close Robert and Joe were. But I think as soon as things went wrong, this is where I think we disagree a little bit. I think as soon as things went wrong, the Dom sub thing went out the window and it went back to who ran that house. And that was Joe. And just like when Dylan started speaking to the police, Joe looked at him and he stopped. I think he got Joe. He freaked out. He said, I was trying to do this thing. I wanted to do this thing. It's gone horribly wrong. Robert's dead. What are we going to do? And I think at that point, Joe took over. And I think even though I think he probably made Dylan be the one to do the stab wounds just because it was his fault, I think it was his idea. Never going to be able to prove that unless anybody says it. But I just think when the panic hit and it was time for someone to take charge of the situation, it was Joe that would have done that. And that makes the case even more tragic because that was supposed to be his best friend.
That's a really interesting theory. I hadn't thought about it in that manner, that who was in control may have flipped in the midst of it. Let me be clear about something that some people in the chat may have misunderstood both of us. I don't think they stabbed him to kill him. I think they thought he was already dead. I don't think maybe they didn't even know until, the autopsy didn't indicate that anything other than the stab wounds killed him. So I think even to this day, they thought they drugged him to death and they thought he was dead, cold, because you can be cold to the touch at this point, and his heart had stopped beating perceptibly. So they may have not felt a pulse. They may not have seen breath, and he may have been cold to the touch, and they actually thought he was dead. So the stab wounds weren't done in like some sort of terrible, let's mutilate him way. It was quite literally the cover up of a corpse is what they thought. I think the problem was he wasn't actually dead when they stabbed him. Hence the kind of interesting situation we find ourselves in. And a really interesting thing you note about if Dylan was the one to drug him, so he's the one who actually, in their minds, killed him. But then if Joe made the decision to stab and the autopsy actually says he died by stab wounds, that may be a big reason why both of them may have almost equal blame in their eyes under the law, why they haven't turned on each other. Because remember, right now, it's Victor and Joe are together still. Victor's not going to turn. This is his husband. Why turn on his husband? But Dylan has left the trio. So what is keeping Dylan and Joe from turning on each other? I think what you say may have a very powerful impact as to the prisoner's dilemma issue, because they each have a role in his death, right? Whichever one actually killed him, maybe they think it was the injections that killed him, and the autopsy says it's the stab wounds. Well, if Joe is the one who made the call to stab him, whether he was the one to stab him or not, you can see how if you brought a murder charge, the autopsy says died by stab wounds. Who made the call to stab him? Joe. You can see how that's a very clean path to conviction. And that may be the reason, even though they are on their separate ways, they are no longer together. They're not covering for each other in the sense of like out of a loving relationship loyalty, the way that I think Joe and Victor still have. That may be why. Prosecutors.
Yeah, and the people who knew said things along the lines of Victor would do anything for Joe, Joe would do anything for Dylan, and Dylan would do anything for himself. So all three of them have a reason not to come clean. I do think, as we've said many times, that Victor is the least involved, but I do think once he made that 911 call, he was locked in, because at that point he did have an involvement in the sort of after the killing. He was helping covering it up. I don't feel like he had any direct involvement in the murder. And I think, honestly, this is what happened to the judge. I think the judge probably thinks the same thing we do. I think she probably thinks that Joe and Dylan were equally involved in this, but she wasn't sure about Victor. And since she wasn't sure about Victor, she just felt like she couldn't find all three of them guilty, which I still don't understand. But I think Victor is the least culpable. And as we said, would have been the person that we would have targeted to try and get them to flip on the other three. I think the problem was, I think Victor probably never would have flipped on Joe. If he could have flipped on Dylan alone, he would have. But I don't think there was any way to do that because of how everything went down.
And really quick on the whole drugging thing. It took me a while, honestly, to settle on the injection because I didn't want to believe that, it seems so risky to walk into someone's room and inject them. Because if I got injected, I would, of course, wake up and then see whoever was doing it. My original theory was that he was drugged when he was drinking something. In addition to it not showing up on the toxicology report, I think that was a bit risky. And there's no indication that anything was having its effect on Robert as he went to bed. He did all the things he normally does before going to bed, putting in his mouth guard, sending that last email, putting his valuables neatly somewhere. There's no indication that he threw up, kind of missed the bed, hit his knee, like he's stumbling, like it's starting to take effect. Those of you who have been slipped a roofie, at a date rape drug at a bar before, thankfully that has not happened to me, but I have seen someone under that effect. They start tripping and it happens pretty immediately. It's hard to time when it's going to take effect. And of course, it's possible that he made it all the way to bed before it took effect, whatever he took, and it didn't show up on the toxicology report. But I think the fact that everything was so regular and normal for him, everything he did was him being self-possessed, in control of how his normal process is, that I think it was something much more fast-acting, like the injection.
And look, this is our theory. We could be wrong. If you disagree with us, I want you to come up with a theory that answers all the questions and fits all the facts. Good luck to you on that. Because
the crazy thing is, I don't think this is a straightforward, we just wanted to have sex with Robert. I don't think that's what it had. I think sex had very little to do with it. Sex assault ended up happening, but I think it was like a tangential thing to a much deeper psychological control issue, which is why this is so difficult to understand, because we are not in anyone's mind.
No, I agree with you 100%. And this is one of those cases that the facts are so strange that, we always say the whole Occam's razor thing. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. I think this is a zebra case. There's zebras running all over this case. So I think you're going to have a hard time coming up with a theory that fits really all the theories. And as some people have said, we've talked to several people about this case. And, the problem with it is you can come up with a theory and it sounds good, and then the more you think about it, you're like, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about that? I think that's one of the reasons this case is so enduring, is it is really hard to feel satisfied when you walk away with it. It's really hard to walk away from this case and think, I got all this. And there are a lot of cases in true crime that seem mysterious, and then when you sit down and when you really look at the facts, you're like, this is not mysterious. It's tragic, but it's probably pretty simple, and this is the simple thing that happened, and we deal with those cases all the time. I don't think this is one of those cases. I don't think you're going to come up with a simple answer for this one. I think you're going to have something pretty wild going on, and our theory, I'm not going to say it's not wild. I think it is wild, but I think it answers all the questions. Frankly, whether it's right or not, I think it answers all the questions, and that's why I'm satisfied with it. Want to hear what you guys think. We've been talking about this case for a while. There's a lot of facts out there. There's a lot of resources that you can review. Want to hear what you think we got right, what you think we got wrong. I want to hear your theories. If you have a theory that you think fits the evidence and lines up with everything, let us know. We want to hear it. And if there are any really good ones, we'll share them later. So you guys can be a part of this as well. Alice, before I move on to questions, is there anything else you want to add about this case?
Yeah, and that is that I think there is just a tragic victim in all of this, Robert. I think he had no idea what he was walking into that night at all, that he trusted a friend, and this was just crashing on a friend's couch for the night so he wouldn't have to make a long drive home. And the best thing I can hope for him is that he didn't know that any of this happened. But that doesn't mean that all the people he left behind doesn't have to live with the enduring mystery, the enduring rumors that float around his character, around his potential infidelity, that continue to this day, that is probably just creating more grief and suffering for those who do love him. And this is because of, I think, a lot of selfishness.
No, I think that's right. And I often wonder how people live with themselves when they get away with crimes. But this one, I mean, a lot of crimes, the person who's killed is not someone you know. They're not someone you know well, or maybe you convince yourself they deserved it. How do you live with yourself on this one? I mean, you could not be a more innocent victim, in my opinion, than Robert was. And I truly believe that he was murdered by people that he trusted and he believed in and he felt safe with. And that's one of the worst thoughts of all.
And one last thing I want to say that kind of burned me with anger from the initial statements to the police was, I think I may be misstating this, but I'm pretty sure it was Dylan who said it. Who cares if it's one of, it was either Dylan or Victor who said it, but one of them, and I think it was Dylan, said, I barely knew the guy. It's just not true. They knew him. Of course, we have gradations of who we call friends, but when you're talking about someone who just died in your study that night, the response is not, I barely knew him. You clearly knew him because you let him stay in your house. And that angers me deeply because this was a betrayal by friends, plural. Clearly, there was a very close friend there, Joe, but this was a betrayal by friends.
Yeah. And look, we talked about this before. You know, if there's ever more evidence in this case, it can still be prosecuted. The murder itself, there's double jeopardy on the cover-up of the murder because they were acquitted. But that is a separate crime with separate facts. The murder itself could be charged again, though if it is, the defense attorney on the documentary will not be representing the defendants because he has been disbarred. So if you didn't like him, he's not a lawyer anymore. So don't worry about that. Well, I don't know. We were going to ask questions, but I'm depressed by this case. So I think just no questions today. We're just going to end this one in sadness, and we'll move on to another case next week, and we can do questions then. But we do want to hear from you guys. prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media, including TikTok, where we are now TikToking away. So check that out. If you leave a 5-star review, you get a question. If you leave a 1-star review, we might make fun of you later in a TikTok. So, you know, it works either way. For the haters and the lovers, there's something out there for everybody. But thank you to YouTube, everybody watching on YouTube. We love you guys, our patrons who have been with us through this and so impatiently waiting for this episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it as well. Well, Alice, I think you've said your piece, so I'll leave that as the last word. We'll be back next week with a case that is so much more enjoyable than this one. And we can't wait to do it. It's going to be so much fun. So we're going to actually do a fun case. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's one of the great ones out there. So we're excited about it. We just had the opportunity to visit Lidditz Elementary School. We actually went up there. It was great. Met with the kids, and we talked about this case. So we're excited to share with you everything we learned from those great kids starting next week. One other thing I want to mention, pure coincidence, but the consult is also doing Robert Wone, even as we're doing it. So if you're listening to this now, they should have 3 or 4 episodes out. If you're listening to this live, they'll be starting shortly. Make sure you listen to them. I can't wait to see what they say because, you know, they actually know what they're talking about, whereas we just make things up as we go along. So it'll be really interesting to hear what the profilers think about this case. So listen to the consult if you can't get enough of Robert Wone. All right. Well, we'll be back next week with a much more fun case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, guys. When I had to sit here for 10 minutes and sit with my thoughts about Robert, it got really sad. So sorry, you were seeing really sad Alice. But I skipped my cup of coffee today. Never do that. Never go cold turkey on coffee, especially when you're a 5-cup of coffee a day person. Because I was feeling good. The sun was shining. I was running around, and I was I worked out, and then I did something with the kids, and I was I don't need coffee. I'll pass the top. but I think it's adrenaline. So anyways, TMI, sorry.
Wow. Okay.
I'm all hyped up on Mountain Dew. I'm really excited.
I can tell.
I'm gonna get sued. That's why I'm all hyped up.
This is gonna be a wild one, guys. This is gonna be a wild one.
I'm so
You
gonna
can
get
tell.
sued.
I don't know what's gonna happen on this. Just go. Okay, here we go.